On the 28th of November 1994, a 6-year-old boy woke up in his house on the Welland Estate in Peterborough. His mother was asleep. He made his own breakfast, got himself dressed in his school uniform, grey trousers, white shirt and black shoes, a blue coat with a zip up the front, and he quietly let himself out of the front door. He was going to school, and his name was Rikki Neave. There is a content warning with this episode. This case involves the neglect and the death of a child, and some details will be hard to talk about and hard to hear. But I think what happened to Rikki deserves to be told. I'm Claire, and this is Whispers in the Dark. Peterborough, in Cambridge, 74 miles north of London, sitting on the River Nene, about 24 miles from the Lincolnshire coastline, between East Anglia and the East Midlands. Most people in the UK know Peterborough as a city where your passport gets renewed, but it's more than that. It's a really old historic city. It has a cathedral named the Cathedral of St. Peter, St. Paul and St. Andrew, and it's one of the finest Norman buildings in the whole of the United Kingdom. It sits in the heart of the city, and the west front has 3 enormous arches, each one framing an entrance. Unlike anything else in England, construction began 1118. And on the north aisle there's a tomb in very plain stone with a simple inscription. Catherine of Aragon is buried there, Henry VIII's first wife, the woman who refused to accept an annulment and helped tear the English church from Rome. The cathedral owes its very existence to her. When Henry dissolved the monasteries, Peterborough was spared, and some historians believe because there was a queen buried beneath the floor. Designated as a new town in 1960, it expanded rapidly. New housing developments started popping up, fast roads linking them, and the Welland Estate was one of them. It sits on the northeast of the city in an area called Dogthorpe. So it got around 2,500 people living there in low-rised, terraced, semi-detached houses built in 1960 on the American planning model called the Rayburn layout. The idea that Radburn had was a particular vision of how families should live. Keep the cars away from the front of the doors entirely, tucking them round the back out of sight, and let the front of every house open onto a pathway rather than a road. Those footpaths connected everything. They ran between houses, across the green open spaces, through the estate, linking neighbours to neighbours, homes to schools. The Welland Primary School was there on the estate itself, and so was a parade of shops. And at the edge of the estate, woodlands. The cars were at the back. The front of the estate, the part you lived in, walked through, sent your children out into, was quiet and away from cars. A great place for kids to play out. It was peaceful, green, and by the 90s the estate was packed and getting an expansion programme. So, also around that time, we can remember a beautiful and talented rock star, Kurt Cobain, who was only 27 and in his Seattle home put a gun to his head and ended his life and broke hearts around the world. That same year, in South Africa, Nelson Mandela was elected president, a vote that ended his 27 years in prison for daring to fight for equal rights in his own country. It ended a racial legal system of segregation that determined where you could live, where you could work, where your children could attend school, what buses you could ride, and even who you were allowed to marry. It was an enforced state since the year 1948. And it ended that year in 1994, and Mandela became president. Also that year, Jeff Bezos started a small online bookshop called Amazon. So, Rikki Neave. He lived on Red Mile Walk on the Welland Estate. He was born on the 4th of March 1988. His mother was Ruth. His father, Trevor, left when Rikki was 3. Ruth, Rikki's mom, was drowning, and she had been for a long time. Young, unmarried and unsupported. Within a few years, she had 2 more children, Rochelle in 1992 and Sheridan in 1993. She'd had Rikki young. 3 children, under 7, and she wasn't coping at all. By the time Rikki was 6, the house was in chaos. Ruth was using amphetamines, and it showed, and her children suffered. Her moods swung wildly. One day, frantically cleaning, desperate to get control. The next, aggressive and annoyed, and then she slept for hours or days, unreachable, while the children fended for themselves. A model mother she was not. And for her children, it was a hard childhood. Social services knew about the family. They visited, they made notes. Neglect, children left alone, the state of the home, and the Neave children were flagged as at risk. But there were worse cases, families in deeper crisis. Rikki and his sisters got what attention the system could spare. Their reach was thin at best. But actually, you could say that Rikki managed, despite his home life challenges. He was 6 years old and had already learned to take care of his young sisters. He knew how to make toast when Ruth wasn't awake. He knew how to get his sisters dressed. He'd learnt to be quiet when his mum was sleeping and to keep the little ones occupied, to handle things that shouldn't have been his responsibility. His head teacher at the Welland Primary School, Mrs. Boxall, noticed him immediately. He was cheeky, restless. He talked too much, tested every boundary possible to him. The kind of 6-year-old that makes teachers smile and exhausted at the same time. But there was something else, something sharp and watchful. He was clever, alert. There was a guardedness to him that a child shouldn't have needed. He'd had to grow up fast. Teachers commented. He would tell me he was late because Mommy was asleep on the settee and he'd had to get his own breakfast. He also told me several times that he had to make dinner as well, and for his sisters. 6 years for Rikki meant managing meals when his mum wasn't awake and taking care of the little ones. Ruth said about Rikki that she thought he'd be a mechanic or an electrician. He could take things apart and put them back together again. He was good with his hands and he had a good brain. So, on the 28th of November 1994, Rikki woke up. He ate breakfast, Weetabix. Mum wasn't awake, so he got himself dressed. At around 9:30, so he was late, he let himself out of the front door and left for school. He never arrived. In school, his absence was marked. It was Rikki. His attendance wasn't great, so his absence was recorded, like all of the other times, but the school failed to call home, well, because of Ruth. They knew what home life was like, and that his lack of attendance was a thing. Rikki was normally home by 3:45. When he wasn't, Ruth waited. She called around. Nobody had seen him. The minutes stretched slowly, and she waited. The fear and dread that every parent fears, slowly setting in. At 6 o'clock, she called 999. Her son was missing. He hadn't come home from school. He was only 6. He was wearing a white shirt, grey trousers, blue coat. He never stayed out like this before. He always came home. And the police arrived at Red Mile Walk at 17 minutes past 6. The officers searched the estate that evening. They looked in gardens, in stairwells, under hedges. They called his name. The footprints between the houses, the green spaces, the woodlands at the edges of the estate. Suddenly, they all seemed packed together. That design, the Radburn design, those quiet, unobserved pathways and corridors that were designed to keep children safe from cars, they made it almost impossible to know where a child had gone or who had seen him leave. Rikki wasn't found that night. We don't know the details of that search, lost in time, but we do know that he wasn't found that night. He was only 6, and no matter what state Ruth's life was in, we can only imagine the torture that she went through that night. By sunrise, he still wasn't found. No answers, no clues, no witnesses. And then at 12:05 the next day, 29th of November, 1994, PC Malcolm Graham, searching a woodland area off I Road, found him, 5 minutes from home. Rikki's lifeless body was lying on his back. He was naked, apart from his socks and shoes, his arms spread wide, his legs placed far apart in a deliberate star shape. His body had been arranged that way, posed, left to be seen. He'd been placed near a children's den in the woods, a place where kids on the Welland Estate played. There was no clothing near him. 18 inches from his left hand, resting on a leaf, was a small, single white shirt button. The search for his clothing took until the following morning. At 9:30 on the 30th of November, a police officer found it on Willoughby Court. His school uniform had been rolled and placed inside. His underwear folded inside the jacket. In the right-hand pocket of his coat, there were 2 small plastic toys and some game cards. 3 small white buttons were missing from his shirt, as if it had been ripped off. The pathologist, Dr. Nat Carey, conducted the examination. There were marks on the neck, petechial hemorrhaging to the eyes and face, tiny red pinpoint bleeds caused by pressure to the neck. Mud on his face, his abdomen, his knees and feet. Rigor mortis had set in, and the ligature mark on his neck was repetitive and linear in pattern, the distinctive marking of a zip fastener. She advised that it looked like he'd been strangled with the zip of his own anorak. A force so violent that it left metal teeth marks as an imprint on his skin. She surmised that he was swiftly executed, a single attack from behind, and he died fairly quickly, within hours of leaving home. The contents of his stomach, the Weetabix he'd had for breakfast. No prolonged struggle, no obvious signs of sexual assault, though the circumstances, stripped naked, posed deliberately in the star shape, indicated the sexual motivation was probably part of it. The mud on his shoes showed that he'd walked into the woods, but he hadn't walked out again. Ruth described a feeling of being paralysed, but whatever she felt, the investigation did not treat her as a grieving mother. Within days, the police attention had settled firmly on her. They interviewed her for nearly 14 hours over 3 days. She was his mother, and she hadn't been a good one. Police brought her in. They interviewed her for 3 days. They went through the house on Red Mile Walk, and when they searched it, they found exactly what they were looking for. Odd books. One page that was open, a depiction of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, the famous drawing of a naked male figure, arms and legs outstretched wide, and it signifies that man is the measure of all things, bridging the earthly and the divine or cosmic realms, placing humanity at the centre of it all. They found other books too, the occult, witchcraft. They thought about the woods off I Road, Rikki's little body naked, arms and legs outstretched. It seemed to fit as a whole picture, the neglect the abuse, the drugs, and the fact that most victims of murder are killed by someone they know and love. Ruth did it. They had her. So on the 19th of January 1995, police arrested Ruth on suspicion of child cruelty. Not murder, there was time for that later. The cameras were already there, outside Ruth's house, when the police arrived. An officer had tipped off a journalist working for the ITV in Peterborough area, leaking the exact timing and location of the arrest. Ruth was filmed being taken out by police and put into a car. The footage ran on the news. The country watched. The cameras felt appropriate. She deserved to be seen for what she'd done. And yes, I remember this being on the news. That same journalist was then given permission by the Cambridgeshire police to film inside the house on Red Mile Walk as well. They filmed that book featuring the Vitruvian Man with the image. That same image would later be produced as evidence at the trial. 11 days later, Ruth appeared before Peterborough magistrates, charged with cruelty to Rikki and to the other children. And by this point, Rikki's sisters, Rochelle and Sheridan, were already in care. Rochelle was 3 years old and Sheridan still a baby. The house on Red Mile Walk stood empty. Rikki's funeral was held on the 14th of February 1995 at Minlin Crematorium in Kings Lynn, Valentine's Day. A brief private service. The press were kept at a distance by tall pine trees surrounding the grounds. His coffin had been brought from the Chapel of Rest in March, Cambridgeshire, and the service began with Rock and Roll Dreams Come True by Meatloaf. His classmates at the Welland Primary School sent a floral spray. His grandparents sent a kite-shaped wreath. His father, Trevor, who wept openly at the police press conference in the days after Rikki's death, sent yellow roses and carnations. Someone left a floral tribute in the shape of a bicycle. Ruth attended. She was on bail. And then, a few months later, on May the 25th, 1995, she was formally charged with Rikki's murder. She denied it. The trial opened at Northampton Crown Court on October 1996 and it lasted a month. The lead detective of the investigation was Detective Superintendent Keith Chamberlain. His team had built a case around Ruth. The Vitruvian Man, the occult, the neglect, the history of cruelty, the chaos of the house on Red Mile Walk, and of course the drug use. The jury heard what Ruth had done to Rikki. And this is hard to read. It's going to be hard for you to hear. They heard that when Rikki was 4, Ruth had poured washing up liquid down his throat as a punishment. The prosecution told the court that as the liquid burned, Rikki whispered, "I love you, Mummy." They also heard that when he was 3, she'd locked him outside the house in December in his pyjamas in the cold, also as a punishment. They heard that she held him upside down over a bridge as he screamed, that she'd written "idiot" on his forehead in felt-tip pen and told him not to wash it off. That on a visit to the chemist, she'd hit him with such force that he went flying out of the door, and that she'd hit him with a brush so hard that the brush broke. They heard that she even sent him out to buy amphetamines for her, a 6-year-old boy running errands for his mother's addiction. Ruth's former partner, Dean, had given a statement. He said he'd left the house because of the way she treated the children. She was always shouting and screaming, he said. She hit them regularly, not smacks, punches and kicks and shoves down the stairs. One neighbour described Rikki as a sad little messenger of misery. The prosecution told the jury he was like a toy. She could do what she wanted with him. And after each beating, this child would curl up and whisper, "Mummy, I love you." The prosecution's theory of the murder was this, that Ruth killed Rikki at home and then, after reporting him missing, during the night, she'd wheeled the body to the woods in a pushchair and posed him there. A soil expert could have actually testified that the mud on Rikki's shoes showed that she'd walked into the woods himself. He hadn't been wheeled there, but the expert was never called. Nobody looked at the mud on his shoes. The jury retired and they came back unanimous. Not guilty of murder, not enough evidence. But Ruth had already pled guilty to child cruelty, 5 counts relating to Rikki, 2 counts relating to the other children, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Even though she wasn't ruled guilty of murder, the case was closed. The police had their murderer, and the country agreed that she'd got away with it. The trial judge, Justice Popplewell, heard all of it, and his words to Ruth from the bench were scathing. "You are plainly an inadequate person and a wholly unfit mother." She was sent to Holloway, North London, the largest women's prison in Western Europe. Myra Hindley was there, the Moore's murderess. She and Ruth were actually in the same building. The days at Holloway ran on strict routine: work, meals, exercise, education, lights out. Kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning. There were courses there, GCSEs, hairdressing, typing, gardening. There was structure, the same structure, day after day, that Ruth's life outside had never once had. In a woman's prison, there was also a hierarchy. Everyone knows it. Those who hurt children sit at the bottom of it. Ruth Neave, convicted of cruelty to her son, acquitted of murder, which the woman in there could interpret how they liked. She walked onto the wing knowing exactly where she stood. Despite that, she got on well with everybody, and she told them the truth. She convinced them. Despite that, she got on with everybody. She told them her truth. She managed to convince everybody that she hadn't actually killed Rikki. She served 4 years of the 7, and she came out in 2000, clean. The amphetamines were gone. Prison had given to her one thing her life outside has never managed to provide: a structure. She went to Cambridge, 30 miles south of Peterborough, after her release, and she went directly to the woods off I Road. She stood in the place where Rikki's body had been found, and there she scattered his ashes. Every year on his birthday she visited, and she went and she released balloons in his favourite colour. She tried to carry on with her life, and eventually she met Gary at Histon Football Club on the outskirts of Cambridge. He was 10 years older than her, steady, dependable, and they married. He also became her carer too. Ruth had health issues. Her health had deteriorated badly. She had severe arthritis and struggled to walk. She never forgot about Rikki. How could she? And her story had never changed. Not in the police interviews, not in the trial, not in the 4 years in Holloway, and not in the years that follow. She hadn't killed Rikki. She'd said it from the beginning, and she was still saying it now. She could have faded away, kept her head down, stayed quiet. The entire country believed pretty much that she'd strangled her own child and walked away from it. Coming forward meant giving all of that a second run, her face in the papers again. The name Ruth Neave remembered all over again. Nobody believed there was someone else out there. That was the reality of it. The country had made up its mind in 1995, and nothing had shifted. She'd been acquitted, people thought, on a technicality, or that the jury had got it wrong. But Gary encouraged her, and he said simply, "If you want to go and get justice, we'll do it." They tried the police first. Throughout 2013, they pushed the Cambridgeshire police for a cold case review. In late 2013, 2 detectives, Warren and Bruning, met with Ruth and Gary and told them plainly there was insufficient evidence. Unless something new emerged, the case would remain closed. Ruth was terrified of going to the press. They'd vilified her before, but Gary encouraged her to go. So in January 2014, Gary contacted John Elworthy, the editor of the Cambridgeshire Times. First meeting happened through a car window in a pub car park in Soham. Over the following days, they met frequently for a dinner at a pub in Soham, Ruth and Gary laying everything out: the case, the trial, the not guilty of murder verdict, and the 14 years since. Elworthy wrote that he grew fond of them, that he never wanted to quit, and that he believed her, even when it caused him problems. A family member threw coffee over him, in their words, for siding with scum. That January, the Cambridgeshire Times ran his findings across 5 pages. Ruth held a press conference and she went back to the Welland Estate and stood in Willoughby Court, the place where Rikki's clothes had been found in the wheelie bin. She spoke publicly about her son's murder and she pushed the Cambridgeshire police to reopen the case. They refused again, and in August of 2014, detectives confirmed there was not enough evidence. Case closed. But Ruth and Gary kept going. Elworthy kept writing, and the police said no again. Then, Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Fullwood became involved. He'd taken over as head of the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crimes Unit in 2013. When Ruth and Gary's campaign reached him, he saw it differently and ordered a cold case review. 8 months going through everything. What had been done, what had not been done, what had been missed, discarded or ignored. A second post-mortem examination had actually been conducted at the time of Rikki's death and never acted upon. Forensic work on the evidence from the original case hadn't been completed, and there was, of course, now DNA technology. So, in June 2015, nearly 21 years after Rikki's body was found, Fullwood drove to Ruth and Gary's. So, in June 2015, nearly 21 years after Rikki's body was found, Fullwood drove Ruth and Gary to Huntington Police Station. 2.5 hours later, they held a press conference announcing that Cambridgeshire police were officially reopening the case. Ruth said afterwards, "I told him I could kiss him. I was in such shock to hear that we were finally being listened to and believed." The re-investigation began immediately. Paul Fullwood described it as one of the biggest challenges in the history of the force, surpassed only, he said, by the Soham murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The team took 1,500 witness statements and analysed around 15,000 documents, 3 times more than would normally be expected on a case of this scale. They started from scratch, and the first thing they discovered was the scale of what had been lost. 45 key exhibits from the original investigation had been destroyed, discarded, or returned to the family. Rikki's blue coat, the zip of which had been used to strangle him, was gone. The murder weapon itself, in 2002, 2 years after Ruth had been released from Holloway, the Cambridgeshire police had sent her son's belongings back to her, his coat, his clothes, and she'd got rid of them. She had no idea they could still be used as evidence. Nobody had told her. The wheelie bin on Willoughby Court, where his clothes had been found, had gone too. No record of it ever existed. In 1994, a forensic scientist named Peter Lamb had identified fibres on Rikki's clothing that he believed could match the killer's. He'd been ready to test them. He'd been waiting for clothing from potential suspects to be sent to him. They'd never arrived. Nobody had asked. So the clothes were gone. But what survived were the tapings. So those are basically sellotape applied to the outer surfaces of Rikki's clothing in 1994, lifted to collect fibre samples. And they'd been stored carefully in evidence for 21 years. Cellmark Forensic Services examined them using STR-Mix, a DNA analysis technology capable of extracting and interpreting mixed DNA profiles from samples previously considered inconclusive or unreadable. The work was painstaking. The tapings were 21 years old and the profiles were mixed. It took months. In February 2016, 8 months after the reinvestigation began, the results came back. There was a hit. The DNA on those tapings matched a profile already held on the national database, 1 billion to 1. A man with a criminal record, a man from the Welland Estate, a man who had been a boy in 1994. He'd been only 13 years old. James Watson was now 34 years old. Born on the 1st of April 1981, he was now living with no fixed address, in and out of trouble, a string of convictions behind him. Detective Fullwood said the more we looked at James Watson, the more convinced we were that he was the person responsible for the dreadful murder of Rikki. He was designated as a suspect. But as the team went back through the original investigation files, they found something else. Watson's name was already there. On the 5th of December 1994, a week after Rikki's body was found, Watson had been interviewed by police after a witness had seen him on the morning walking with Rikki, and they were heading in the direction of the woodland where Rikki's body had been found. Watson told them that he'd only briefly spoken to Rikki and then they'd gone their separate ways, and that was it. He was 13. His name went on the file and it had stayed there for 21 years. The team began building a picture of who he was, pulling social services records, care home records, old police logs, school attendance registered, criminal histories. Agencies that had known him as a child flagged him, recorded things, but never joined any of it up. His father, James Watson Sr., had been serving as a Cambridgeshire police officer in April 1994. 7 months before Rikki's murder, Watson had reported his father and said that he'd physically assaulted him. His father had been arrested and subsequently jailed. The passage of time, we couldn't actually find anything more about this. But as a result, Rikki couldn't live with his mother. She was also living with somebody that Rikki couldn't live with. And so social services had stepped in. James Watson first went to a foster carer named Molly Donald, whose home was actually close to the Neave family home on the Welland Estate. Then, after behavioural problems, including being found in possession of a shotgun, he was moved to the Woodgate Children's Home in March, 12 miles from Peterborough. Social services had been treating Watson as a vulnerable child since March of 1993. He was truanting heavily from Walton School. He attended only 18 of 38 days on one recorded period. When Watson was 11, he'd actually sexually assaulted a 5-year-old boy, a friend of Rikki's. The boy's mother had reported it. Watson was interviewed in the presence of a social worker and he denied it. He claimed that he'd only shown the boy how to shake himself after having a pee, and that was as far as the incident went. When Watson was 13 and living at Woodgate, a staff found things in his room. A pheasant carcass dismembered, magazines of children's clothing, just the underwear sections. A home manager flagged it, but nothing more was done. 3 days before Rikki died, by all accounts, he talked even about fantasizing about violence, about strangling a child and leaving its body naked and posed in the woods. And shortly before Rikki went missing, a local radio station received a prank call. It was about a 2.5-year-old boy who'd been abducted and strangled and left in the woods near the Welland Estate. James Watson was rehearsing, seeing how things played out in the world, and nobody had made the connection. In the days that followed Rikki's murder, teachers at Watson School noticed that he became intensely interested in the coverage of Rikki's murder. He'd made 25 copies of the front page of the Peterborough Evening Telegraph, Rikki's face filling the page. It sounds so obvious now, but he was only 13 years old. and the police had their focus on Ruth. So Watson got on with his life, and did he do anything useful with it? No. At 15, still at Woodgate, he began a relationship with a girl in the home. They'd had a son together. The convictions began almost immediately after Rikki's death. In January 1995, while still at the children's home, he stole track signal detonators and laid them on the railway line for fun, he said. He stole cars, he set fires. The offences accumulated over the years, in and out of custody, no fixed address for long stretches of time. While serving one sentence, he'd completed an Open University course in animal care, and he was proud of that. He said he always wanted to be a vet, but he complained that he didn't have enough qualifications. And he was also quoted as saying that he actually only committed crimes in order to get arrested and go to prison, because prison was the only place that people asked if he was okay. In April 2016, Watson was arrested on suspicion of murder and taken in for questioning. When asked about the morning of the 28th of November 1994, his account was the same that he'd given the police when he was a 13-year-old boy. He'd seen Rikki briefly, they'd spoken, and they'd gone their separate ways. There was no physical contact. He'd never been anywhere near touching Rikki Neave. Then detectives presented the DNA evidence from the tapings on Rikki's coat, that his DNA had been found on Rikki. And then his story changed suddenly. Watson remembered something. He thought he might have picked Rikki up, lifted him under the arms so that he could see over a fence. There was a construction site nearby on the estate, and there was a digger on it. Rikki loved diggers. He'd been curious and wanted to see it, and Watson had held him up so that he could look over a tall fence. He said they hadn't been together long. 3-4 minutes max, that was all. That is how the DNA had been on Rikki's clothing, touch DNA, that was all. It was an innocent moment of contact, nothing more. But to detectives, something niggled. They went back to the original evidence in the boxes found. They actually came across a photograph from the Welland Estate in 1994. The images were of the area that Watson described. The construction site that was there, the digger that was there, the groundwork was clearly visible, exactly as Watson had described, but with one crucial difference. The fence wasn't there. It hadn't been erected yet. On the morning of the 28th of November 1994, the construction site was completely open. There was nothing to lift Rikki over. There was nothing to see over. Anybody standing there could see the digger without needing assistance. Got ya. They'd caught him in a lie, and that was good enough. He was charged with the murder of Rikki Neave. And then he was released on bail. But he was placed in a bail hospital with conditions: behave and stay in the country. A bail hostel is a kind of supervised accommodation used for people awaiting trial who are considered manageable risks. A man with Watson's history of sexual assault of a 5-year-old boy, arson, a string of convictions, and now a murder charge, was free to pretty much come and go as he pleased. So 3 months later, in July, he just walked out. Didn't come back. He and another man loaded a motorhome and drove to Dover. Watson boarded a cross-channel ferry as a vehicle passenger. No checks. No alarm. They drove through France, they drove through Europe and on to Portugal. He'd escaped. He'd got away with it. Again. And worse. He posted photographs on social media as he went. Sunbathing on the beach, drinking a beer, posing with his arm around a Portuguese police officer, smiling into the camera. He wasn't hiding. He was taunting. He even wrote online, "The best thing is, I don't even have a passport. I just walked out of the country. Me and my mate left the UK in a mobile home, booked it on a ferry and drove on. That was it. No checks, nothing." The big plan was to get to Thailand somehow. Of course, it collapsed. The money ran out. His friend came home, and Watson ended up living alone in Lisbon, homeless, sleeping in strangers' rooms and wandering the streets with no money. On the 14th of July, he emailed his probation officer. He wanted to come home. His probation officer replied with questions. Where are you? How can we support you getting back? Watson wrote, I'm in a world of trouble. I left with the assumption we were going to Thailand and I could see a bit of Europe for a few days. I stayed in a room with some people I'd met, but it wasn't long term. And now I don't know what my next plan should be. The probation officer, of course, referred the matter to the police and they sent Watson an email that same day. Also, Watson's sister Claire had been in contact with him. He told her that he was in a lot of trouble, he'd made huge mistakes, and he needed help. He'd said he was planning to go to the British consulate in Lisbon to get emergency travel documents so he could get back into the UK. His sister Claire told the police, and of course they were waiting for him when he turned up at the consulate. On the 2nd of August 2016, just 3 weeks after leaving the UK, thinking he was some kind of international criminal mastermind, Watson was arrested in Lisbon. He consented to extradition and 10 days later he was back in the UK. He was back to finally face what he'd done. The CPS, the Crown Prosecution Services, reviewed the evidence, the DNA, the changed story, the fence that didn't exist. They looked at what had been lost. The 45 exhibits, Rikki's coat, the murder weapon, the wheelie bin. The original investigation failures had been catastrophic. And now some of those failures were the reason the CPS said it's not enough. They declined to charge Watson with murder. The same negligence that allowed Rikki's killer to walk free for over 20 years was now threatening to let him walk free again. But Rikki's family refused to accept this. In 2018, they evoked the victim's right to review, a legal process allowing families to challenge a CPS decision not to prosecute. The case went back. A different CPS lawyer reviewed the same evidence. And in October 2019, that lawyer reached a different conclusion. Watson should face trial. 19th of February 2020, James Watson was charged, finally, with the murder of Rikki Neave. He denied it. And then he challenged the legality of the extradition process used to bring him back from Portugal in an attempt to have the case thrown out before it ever reached a jury. The challenge failed. Then came the pandemic. The trial, already years delayed, was pushed back even further. The trial of James Watson for the murder of Rikki Neave finally opened at the Old Bailey in London on the 18th of January 2022. Watson was 40 years old. Ruth Neave was there. She sat in the court. She gave evidence for the prosecution. But Watson's own defence barrister suggested to the jury that it was the old story. Ruth, his mother, not Watson, was responsible for Rikki's death. Rikki's sisters were there too. Rochelle, Rebecca and Sheridan sat in the courtroom and watched. Watson sat in the dock throughout and said nothing. Prosecutor John Price QC laid out the case. It was a jigsaw, he said. No single piece enough by itself, but put together, it was overwhelming. The DNA, 1 billion to 1, established close physical contact with Rikki's clothing at the point of death. The timing, a Weetabix at 9:30, meant that Rikki had died soon afterwards. Watson seen walking with Rikki towards the woods. Three days before Rikki died, Watson had visited his mother, told her about this dream and fantasy about strangling this 2-year-old child and leaving it naked in the woods. He'd also invented a local radio report, a prank, about a body found in the woods on the Welland Estate. And then the fence. The photograph from 1994 that showed the construction site exactly as it was on the morning Rikki died. No fence. It hadn't been built yet. The jury also heard from a former girlfriend of Watson's. She described how Watson had taken her to the woods to perform sex. A survival kit in his bag, including a knife. He'd put his hands around her neck, so hard it had left marks on her throat. She thought he was going to try and strangle her, and during one encounter, Watson had killed a bird and spread its wings wide, a deliberate echo of the way Rikki's body had been posed. He'd done it before. He'd done it to Rikki. Paul Fullwood, who had led the cold case, was unequivocal. He called Watson a fantasist, a dangerous individual, and a compulsive liar. The defence argued reasonable doubt. Jennifer Dempster QC, Watson's barrister, maintained his innocence throughout, and the jury retired on the 6th of April, 2022. They deliberated for 36 hours and 31 minutes spread over 2 weeks, and finally, on the 11th of April, the judge gave a majority direction. The deliberations continued, and then, on the 21st of April, they finally returned. Guilty, by a majority of 10-2. Before sentencing, the court heard victim impact statements. Rochelle, Rikki's sister, addressed the court. She said, "I was only 3 when Rikki was murdered, and I was removed from my family. After I entered the care system, I suffered severe mental health issues. I remember Rikki feeding me and washing me and helping me with my clothes. He has missed so much of our lives. I also wonder what he would have been like if he was still here, but sadly, I'll never know, because he was taken from me." Rebecca, Rikki's eldest sister, broke down as she addressed the court, and Sheridan said, "I think we were let down by the police at the time. We were let down by social services. We were let down by everybody who was in our lives, who was meant to care." So on the 24th of June, 2022, Justice McGovern sentenced James Watson. She said, "Rikki was a child, too willing to trust and engage with strangers. He never had a chance to grow up, to be happy, and to lead a normal and fulfilling life. That opportunity was denied to him by his murderer. The chance for his sisters to grow up knowing him and having a bond with him had been taken away." She said, "I am sure that in the period before the murder, James Watson had been thinking and planning it." He received life imprisonment, the minimum term. The point before which Watson cannot be considered for release was set at 15 years minus 843 days that he'd already served. And the reason for the 15 years was simple and enraging. The law required that Watson's sentence be that of a 13-year-old boy, the age he was at the time when he'd murdered Rikki, not of a 41-year-old man that sat in the dock. If he'd been convicted as an adult, the minimum term would be 30 years. For Watson, the judge, however, increased it to 15, accounting for premeditation and the vulnerability of the victim and the age difference between them. Rikki's sisters were furious. Rochelle, Rebecca and Sheridan wrote to the Attorney General asking for a sentence review. They said James Watson was engaging in adult behaviour by the time he was 13. This, we believe, was a premeditated attack on our brother. He wasn't a young child who made a mistake. He was a troubled boy who was carrying his behaviours into adult life. The Attorney General reviewed the sentence and it wasn't increased. 15 years stood. In June 2023, Watson was granted permission to appeal his conviction. His lawyers argued that the loss of the 45 exhibits had deprived him from a fair trial. Rochelle called the appealing appalling. She said it just shows how callous and unemotional a person he really is. He doesn't care what he's done or the people he's hurt. And then in September 2023, a panel of judges thankfully dismissed his appeal. He had received a fair trial and his conviction stood. James Watson was placed at HMP Durham, a prison built in 1819 and one of England's oldest prisons. Myra Hindley was held there. Ian Brady, Ronnie Cray and Anne and Mary Ann Cotton, the Victorian serial killer who poisoned 21 people, was also kept there and executed there and buried in the grounds. Watson is 43 years old. He will be 56 before he can even be considered for release, and only then if the parole board believe that he's no longer a danger to the public. He will remain on licence for the rest of his life. There is a government report that exists because of Rikki Neave. A formal inspection of Cambridgeshire's Child Protection Services ordered after his death. 40 recommendations, changes made to how the country identified and supported neglected children. His name is on that document. So Rikki's name lives on today, and he is still helping young children who are at risk. That's Rikki. But it was not the neglect that killed him. Rikki's life was hard, way too hard for any 6-year-old. He was kind of coping though, making breakfast, getting his sisters ready, holding things together that he shouldn't have to hold together. And that morning, he walked out of his front door and headed for school, the same as any other day and the same as countless children everywhere. What killed him was James Watson, a 13-year-old boy who had been seen and flagged, recorded and dismissed by every institution he passed through. Watson was 11 when he assaulted a 5-year-old boy, reported and recorded and dropped. He was 13 when staff at the children's home found a dismembered pheasant in his room and the magazines, filled with images of children in their underwear, flagged, nothing more. 3 days before Rikki died, he described in detail what he was about to do. Nobody heard it. Every institution that encountered James Watson saw something. None of them joined it up. No law changed because of it. No system was restrung to better identify and monitor dangerous children. A year before Rikki died, 2 10-year-old boys named Robert Thompson and John Venables abducted and murdered a 2-year-old boy named James Bulger in Liverpool, and Britain was still reeling from it. The question of what children were capable of, what warning signs looked like, what could have been done was everywhere, and yet Watson had slipped through. Perhaps it's different now, I hope so. The framework that exists today for multi-agency safeguarding, police, social services, schools, sharing information, building a picture together weren't in place in 1994. Whether they would have been and it had made a difference, you can't say. But that is the story of Rikki Neave. That's a really difficult story. So that's it. That's the case. And that's where we leave it today. I'm Claire. This is Whispers in the Dark, and thank you for walking this path with me.